Today's episode is supported by the Must Triumph podcast from Sam Yang. Must Triumph is a philosophy podcast produced by a guy who was brought up and influenced by anime, pro wrestling, martial arts, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, and Ralph Nader. And I could tell you the details of what you'd find interesting about an episode or two, but what's really interesting about this podcast is what you see when you look at it holistically. Each episode, even if it seems disconnected from the others, is actually part of a curriculum, and each lesson builds on past episodes. The whole series is really thoughtfully done and will definitely get you thinking in interesting directions. You can find Must Triumph wherever you listen to podcasts or directly at musttriumph.com. And now, welcome to this episode of the award-winning Best of the Left podcast, in which we shall learn about the crisis of illegitimacy our institutions are facing, most starkly at the Supreme Court, and some ideas of what to do about it. Clips today come from the Bradcast, Amicus, Jacobin Radio, Start Making Sense, the Thom Hartmann Program, and The Real News.
It is now official. The Republicans have muscled another extreme far-right winger, one who is accused of multiple alleged sexual assaults and who absolutely lied multiple times under oath to the U.S. Senate onto their already stolen U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is now Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and we'll have the opportunity to help lurch the court and freedoms that many of us have held dear for decades far, far to the right. Yes, for decades. And yes, we are all very screwed. That said, there are still ways to level and or reverse the playing field as we move forward, including adding seats to the U.S. Supreme Court to take back a majority for the majority of Americans who have watched all of this in horror as their key institutions, now including the U.S. Supreme Court, have been stolen from them. There is the possibility of impeachment of Brett Kavanaugh for the same reason that there will always now be an asterisk next to his name in the history books, just as there is one by Justice Clarence Thomas's name, who was placed on the court despite credible allegations of sexual misconduct back in 1991, just as there is an asterisk next to the name of Republican-appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch, next to his name after Senate Republicans took the unprecedented step of refusing to even vote on a nominee by a Democratic president to fill a vacancy on the court for nearly a year under Barack Obama. Just as there is arguably an asterisk next to the other two Republican-appointed justices on the court, Roberts and Alito, who sit on the bench only due to George W. Bush's almost certainly stolen election in the year 2000 and his likely stolen re-election in 2004. So it's a fait accompli. All 5 Republican justices on the 9-person court running it now all are under a cloud of uncertainty or corruption or theft or historic disgrace. And yet, for the moment, that's where we are, with many of us hoping to figure out how to carve out the difficult path of reversing the brutalities of this particularly corrupt political pendulum that has slapped the country, if not the world, in the face. But yes, it can be done. No, it will not be easy. Neither will it be quick nor painless, but it must be done. We have, in my opinion, no other choice for the Republic. And in order to do that, it is up to us, to we the people. There are no saviors other than us, other than you and I, people within earshot of my voice. We have to do this thing. And yes, we can do this thing. But we, the people, will have to overcome the same rigged political and corporate media system which has brought us to this moment of history in the first place.
wrapping up one of the most partisan and rancorous confirmation hearings. The best evidence of that, I think, is President Trump at a White House swearing-in ceremony, essentially saying this.
What happened to the Kavanaugh family violates every notion of fairness, decency, and due process. Our country, a man or a woman, must always be presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. And with that, I must state that you, sir, under historic scrutiny, were proven innocent. Thank you.
I guess my first question for you, Senator Merkley, is Brett Kavanaugh took his seat at the court on Tuesday, business as usual. We're all papered over and moving on. How do you think about what has happened and how quickly we've torqued to this is the new reality?
Well, I've got to tell you that I think the wounds are extremely deep. The bitterness is very high because there has been a lot of damage done to both the Senate and enormous damage done to the integrity of the Supreme Court.
And what do you, I want to talk about the Senate in a minute, but when you talk about the integrity of the Supreme Court, one of the paradoxes, of course, is that the Supreme Court, all 9 members are now going to collude in performing normalcy. They have to do that. We talk so much on this show about how the justices, the one thing they have is the public respect and reverence for the institution. And so, on Tuesday we had Justice Kagan giggling with Judge Kavanaugh, Justice Sotomayor pinching Justice Gorsuch. They're going to just double down on the proposition that everything is fine at the court. So when you talk about the integrity of the court, what does that look like to you? Just a public sense that the thing is broken regardless of what they're showing us?
Well, the members of the court certainly will do what they can to make things look normal, but they're not normal at all. The fact is that the court, which was viewed with respect as I grew up as a series of umpires weighing the respective provisions of the Constitution against each other and against the evolving strategies of society, are now viewed as basically a super legislature. They're super legislating on issues involving the environment, on workers, on women's reproductive rights, on the issue of corporate power and corporate speech, a whole series of things that largely boil down to a vision among the 5 Republican members of the court as how to create government by and for the powerful in opposition to the constitutional vision of government by and for the people. Both the stolen Supreme Court seat, stolen from President Obama and delivered to President Trump and filled by Neil Gorsuch, and this nominee who couldn't meet the standards to serve on any form of court, let alone the Supreme Court. This is lasting damage.
My question for you is, isn't this just a mirror image of what Republicans have said about the court when liberals control the court? In other words, they're just regulating, they're making up law from the bench, they answer to no one. Isn't this ultimately just disserving the idea of the rule of law and this neutral court that we all need to believe in order to function in a constitutional democracy? In other words, the kind of politicization you're describing, doesn't it ultimately just undermine the idea of this independent third branch?
Well, we simply have to call the facts as they are, not as we wish them to be. In my lifetime, I've watched the Supreme Courts in country after country become politicized, make extraordinary rulings that change the course of those countries, and I would think, well, it's great that we have a truly set of impartial jurists struggling to get it right in terms of implementing the Constitution. But we no longer have that. And so to pretend otherwise is to live in a fantasy world, a world of what we once had and certainly would hope for again, but do not have now.
You've really given voice to the idea that the White House had way too strong a hand on the steering wheel this time around. And, you make the point that they were the ones who were claiming privilege about 100,000 pages of documents. And they also, I think you've argued, had way too much control over the FBI investigation. Is that also something new? Is that a big shift, that the White House has generally stood back and let the Senate do its work? Or is this just par for the course? The White House protects their nominee.
It is not par for the course. And in that case of the president exercising presidential privilege, normally you think of that in the context of a president protecting internal conversations of that White House. In this case, however, it was about records from a previous president. It wasn't presidential privilege on behalf of President Bush. It was presidential privilege on behalf of President Trump. And normally, and by the way, these terms are synonymous. They're using it synonymous with executive privilege. So normally, when a president exercises executive privilege, there's a log kept saying this document cannot be disclosed because it meets this test of executive privilege. There was no such log or index for the 100,000 documents that were stamped presidential privilege. And for the Senate to allow the White House to block its efforts to review those documents is a complete institutional failure. And it's not that the Senate didn't request those documents. The chair of Judiciary did ask for them. But the fact that he and the majority did not then defend the Senate's role in being able to review information, that is where the majority really fell down. And it wasn't just this. In addition, the White House lawyer, Don McGahn, he called over Republican leaders when they requested information on the 3 years of his service, Kavanaugh's service as staff secretary, something that had been requested by the Senate. And he said essentially to these senators, don't request those documents. So they came back and they said, okay, we're not requesting those 3 years. So 3 years of incredibly important information got blanked out. That's separate and distinct from the 100,000 documents that got marked presidential privilege. And it doesn't even end there, because then the same individual empowered by the White House to mark documents presidential privilege then marked 140,000 pages of documents as committee confidential to prevent the public from being able to see them and to prevent committee members and senators from seeing they got to see them privately in a special room, but they couldn't discuss the contents with the public or with their staff or with experts. And so there was massive compromise from one end to the other of the ability of the Senate to review his record. And the question everyone would say, okay, so what was the president hiding? What did they want to hide with 100,000 documents stamped presidential privilege? We know that during that time, he worked on issues related to torture. We know he received stolen documents from Senate Democrats after he had said he didn't. And then we did find emails that said he did, even without those 100,000 documents. We know that he worked on various nominations and weighed in on those nominations. What did he say? We would have learned a great deal about his partisanship and his judicial perspective from those documents. That's what the president was hiding, and this is unacceptable. And I filed suit to get those documents. Unfortunately, I waited until the committee forwarded it to the full Senate, because I'm not a member of the committee, immediately filed suit, but time ran out. I wish I had done it differently. I wish I had filed immediately upon the use of presidential privilege instead of waiting until the issue came to the broader Senate. That's a lesson learned. If we ever see this in the future, the Senate has to stand up and protect their responsibility under the Constitution to review the record of nominees.
And now for the Midterms Minute, a look at the candidates and races in battleground districts that you need to know about, shout about, and support to make the biggest impact possible in the election on November 6th. As of the release date of this episode, we are exactly 12 days out from Election Day. Time is running out to make a difference. No one wants to wake up on November 7th wishing they had done more. So do it for yourselves, do it for your family, do it for the most vulnerable among us. Get out there and canvass, get out the vote, email and text friends, donate, whatever you can do do it. These elections will affect us and the world for decades to come. According to the latest early voting reports, Republicans are actually outpacing Democratic voters in key states, so do not take the blue wave hype for granted. Information for all of the Battleground races and ways to get involved can be found at the Midterms Minute HQ at bestoftheleft.com/midterms. Today we're wrapping up the toss-up Battleground races for the House that we haven't covered yet. As a reminder, to take the House, Democrats must flip 24 Republican seats. Let's dive in.
In Ohio's 1st District, Democratic attorney Aftab Puraval is challenging Republican incumbent Steve Chabot. Chabot lost the seat to a Democrat in 2008, but got it back in 2010 and has held it since. Trump won here by 6 points, but it was his narrowest margin of victory in Ohio's congressional districts. Chabot was one of those no-shows when constituents demanded a town hall on health care last year, and then he voted for Trump Care. Health care is at the core of Puraval's campaign, along with protecting Social Security, but he is currently behind in the polls.
In Utah's 4th District, Democratic Salt Lake County Mayor Ben McAdams is challenging Republican incumbent Mia Love, the only Republican member of the Congressional Black Caucus. This district was only created in 2010, but was held by a Democrat until Love took the open seat in 2014. The latest polls have the candidates tied at 46% each, with 8% undecided. Love is following the GOP playbook by trying to align McAdams with the Clintons and Nancy Pelosi. McAdams has said he won't support Pelosi as Speaker and has expressed support for anti-corruption legislation to restrict the influence of lobbyists.
And finally, Washington's 8th District is another open seat race. Democratic pediatrician with a degree in astrophysics, Kim Schreier, is challenging Republican former state senator Dino Rossi. The last incumbent won re-election by 20 points, but the district has voted Democratic in the last 3 presidential elections by 2 to 5 points. Rossi calls himself a fiscal conservative with a social conscience, but his record doesn't back that up. Schreier is calling for a Medicare buy-in on a sliding scale, pointing to the outrageous overheads of private insurance and the minuscule overheads of Medicare. Rossi has lost his campaign for governor and both campaigns for U.S. Senate. He got to the State House by appointment.
As a reminder, voter purging is happening across the country, so we urge you to confirm your voter registration ASAP. Visit headcount.org and click Verify Your Registration Status under the Voting Info tab. There, you can quickly be directed to your state's specific website to confirm your voter registration. If there's a problem, call 866-OUR-VOTE to report the problem and get guidance. If your registration is okay, help someone else confirm theirs or obtain the necessary ID they need to ensure there are no surprise problems on Election Day. Links to all the information you heard today, as well as additional resources, are linked in the show notes, and today's Midterms Minute, along with all of our election information, can be found at bestoftheleft.com/midterms. So if making the blue wave a reality in November is important to you, be sure to hit the share buttons to spread the word about supporting Democrats in battleground races across the country via social media, so that others in your network can spread the word too.
We now have, because of this process, the Supreme Court that has been, many people are saying, delegitimized, that it's openly partisan, that, you know, it's always been that way. People who've looked back in history know that that's the case, but now it's bald and open for everyone to see. And it's very, very difficult, despite, you know, Kavanaugh's Wall Street Journal op-ed where he said, I'm going to be nonpartisan, and I, you know, was just angry, but literally I will be impartial. And no one, you know, actually believes that. But now you've also got, you know, somehow because of the Mueller investigation, the FBI was sort of, which, you know, nobody likes the FBI, but then all of a sudden people were relying on it. And now after this investigation, it's also been thrown. Let's say it suffered a big, you know, drop in its esteem by the population. So we're in a situation now where most people don't have real representation. That's absolutely the case. But now we also have most of the institutions completely discredited. So I don't know if we should turn this into a discussion of strategy, but it seems like not a bad idea to talk about what to do now besides mobilizing and striking. The people who voted for Trump can certainly be one to the other side. I've always believed that. So I want to hear what you have to think.
Right. So the crisis of legitimacy, this is a continuum. So the Supreme Court is experiencing a crisis of legitimacy because of the way that the Kavanaugh confirmation process has rolled out and the fact that he's the most unpopular person who's ever been floated to the Supreme Court, like maybe ever. I don't know, certainly in living memory.
Mm-hmm.
And the FBI, too, experiencing a small crisis of legitimacy, though it remains to be seen, because if the Democrats continue to rely on the FBI to fight their battles for them instead of fighting themselves as one of the two major political parties in the United States, obviously tasked with doing politics, then maybe they will resuscitate the reputation of the FBI, and maybe people will fall for it once again. Yeah. But these are part of a continuum of a broader crisis of legitimacy. So I wrote in my essay, The Banality of Brett Kavanaugh, that I think what's really happening is that there's a collapse of the fantasy of meritocracy. The idea that if somebody is up at the highest echelons of power in our society, that is proof that they have some sort of superior hardwiring, they have some special insight that actually, guarantees them the right to be there, right? It's extremely tautological. We know they're up there because they had something special that got them climbing all the way up the ladder. And we know that people can climb all the way up the ladder because look at all these eminent people at the top of the ladder and how eminent they are, right?
Right.
So this has been collapsing for a long time because the flip side of it is that, meritocracy is an ideology that reinforces capitalism. It basically says the people at the top deserve to be there because anybody can get to the top if they work hard enough. But the flip side is that if you're at the bottom, that means you didn't have what it takes or you didn't work hard enough to get to the top. And that worked for a while, but honestly, so many people are at the bottom now that I think people are growing a little resentful and they're growing a little disillusioned with the idea of meritocracy. People know they work hard. People know they deserve good things. The social safety net is fraying. The jobs are not, the opportunities are not presenting themselves. And I think that people's, belief in meritocracy is wearing thin. I think that Trump is actually a phenomenon that speaks to a sort of almost like a nihilistic response to that.
I think that's true.
People know that meritocracy is kind of a sham, and so some people are like, well, let's pick someone who's a complete outsider. I'm tired of all this Ivy League, these Ivy League blue bloods, running the show and telling me that the reason I don't run the show and can't even, get a decent foothold is because I, am inferior or whatever. Like, screw that. I'm going with the outsider. Of course, he's not an outsider, but people have a pretty low level of class consciousness, so they're not thinking about the fact that, a billionaire can never really be an outsider. He's a political outsider. So that's the nihilistic response. But there's another potential response, which is personified in Bernie Sanders, which is that people are rejecting this idea, this meritocratic idea that obviously, Hillary Clinton is at the top because she deserves to be at the top and it's her turn and she has the experience, and you can tell that she has the experience because she's been at the top for a while, and the reason she's been there is because she deserves to be there, which we know because she's there, right? People are waving that away and they're interested in something else. They're interested in, in a politics of economic redistribution and in a politics of giving ordinary people opportunities and spreading around prosperity in our society. So we're looking at two divergent paths here. If there is, in fact, a crisis of legitimacy in the dominant institutions, whether that's the Supreme Court or whether that's, the Ivy League and the pipeline between the Ivy League and the halls of political power, then there are two directions that we can go in. One of them is class conscious and the other one is not. I think that's actually what it comes down to.
Today's episode is sponsored by Madison Reed. Since 2013, hundreds of thousands of women have tried and loved Madison Reed for the way they have revolutionized at-home hair color. Amy Everett founded the company, naming it after her daughter, because the status quo of hair color options either left much to be desired or cost way too much. Madison Reed offers the quality of a salon, the convenience and affordability of at-home hair color, and an ammonia-free formula with ingredients you can feel good about. With beautiful multi-dimensional traditional hair color, you'll look like you just came from the salon, but you'll have saved a whole lot of time and money because Madison Reed color kits are delivered to your door on your schedule for under $25. To get started, find your perfect shade at madisonreed.com, and they have a special offer for you as a Best of the Left listener. Right now, you can get 10% off plus free shipping on your first color kit when you use the promo code LEFT. That's madisonreed.com and use the promo code LEFT.
When the new Congress convenes in January, the House Judiciary Committee will be chaired by Democrat Jerry Nadler. He says he wants to open an investigation into Brett Kavanaugh and what happened and what didn't happen at his confirmation hearings. What do you think they should focus on?
You correctly say that Nadler's interested in this. I think the word wants to do it is perhaps the inappropriate term, at least as you look at how Nadler talks about it. He feels he has a duty to do it. And that's very important because